This case begins, like many others, with a seemingly routine fender bender. It's 2018, and 74-year-old retiree John Arthur Getrew is backing out of his driveway in Hayward, California, when he accidentally bumps into his neighbor. Before long, John was handcuffed and sitting in the back of a squad car. Explore how the 45-year-old case went from a confusing jumble of forensic dead ends to John's eventual conviction. Stay till the end to find out how the case against him was finally cracked. Forensic technology in the early 1960s was practically non-existent. Advances in DNA analysis enabled investigators to extract nuclear DNA from the victim's clothing. Unfortunately, there were no matches in the national database, but this didn't stop them. Investigators built a family tree of close relatives based on the DNA profile extracted from the garment. They then compared this family tree to a national database of convicted criminals and found a distant cousin of Margaret S. Keeler. To say that John was confused would be an understatement. He insisted that he hadn't done anything to Margaret and had no idea how the police had tracked him down. The fact was that Margaret had been killed 55 years before John was arrested. In 1965, he was sentenced to 15 years in a juvenile prison, but was released after serving 6 years. When the news broke that a local Boy Scout leader and respected member of the community had been arrested for a decades-old murder, the public was shocked. How could someone with such a sterling reputation be involved in such a heinous crime? As it turned out, John had been living a double life for almost 50 years. Back in the United States, he got a job as a campus security guard at Stanford University. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd gotten away with murder. In fact, he'd become so obsessed with the case that he'd begun researching it online. The charges stemmed from the killings of Margaret Williams, Leslie Perlov, and Janet Taylor. In each case, John had strangled the victim with her own pantyhose. He was also accused of sexually assaulting Margaret and Leslie. John pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorney argued that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence, and that John had been convicted in absentia for Margaret's murder. But these arguments fell on deaf ears. He even hired a private investigator to dig up new evidence. But his efforts only made him more paranoid. He feared that the police were closing in on him, so he changed his phone number, moved to a different part of town, and deleted his social media accounts. He married, had children, and eventually settled in Hayward, California. They also had a warrant to search his property. What they found was chilling. In his basement, they found boxes of women's clothing, jewelry, and personal items. He was sentenced to 7 years to life in prison. John Arthur Getrew died of natural causes on September 22, 2023, at age 79. But his DNA remains in the state database. Who knows how many more cold cases it will help solve. Some of the items were clearly stolen, but others looked like they belonged to Margaret. The police were able to match some of the clothing to other victims, and that sealed John's fate. Over the years, he became an active member of his church, a Little League coach, and a Boy Scout leader. Nobody in his community had any idea about his dark past, and that's the way John liked it. So why were the police just now taking an interest in him? And what had he possibly done to them? But this person wasn't closely related enough to make a positive identification. So the search began again. Clearly he was trying to hide something, though, because he answered every question with a generic denial. John was working as a cook at the prison and had no alibi for the night Margaret Williams was murdered. Even worse, forensic evidence linked him to the scene of the crime. Her pantyhose were found wrapped around his wrist, and her hair and blood were discovered in his car. While in custody, John confessed to the killing, according to his statement. He and some friends picked Margaret up after school and drove her to the Stanford Dish. There he attacked her, stole her belongings, and left her for dead. The confession seemed airtight. All the evidence against John suddenly made sense. But there was one small problem. Whenever the officers would mention something incriminating, John would respond, "I don't remember," or "I don't recall." This led the officers to believe that he really did have something to hide. But why was he trying to cover up for himself or someone else? They didn't know it at the time, but John wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting his entire family. His cousin's DNA had given them a starting point, but it wasn't a match. The only way to get a definitive answer was to question John himself. Another family member was located, and this time a match was made. The culprit was identified as 18-year-old John Arthur Getrew, a boy who lived on a U.S. military base in West Germany. And although witnesses placed Margaret with a group of men on the day she disappeared, None of these men were ever charged, which seems odd given that Margaret was seen with them. How did they question him without telling him why? And what did John know about the 1963 murder of Margaret Williams? If he wasn't sure already, he was at that point. The man who supposedly had clipped his car asked if he could see John's driver's license and proof of insurance. Normally, these documents wouldn't raise any red flags, but John was in a panic. He fumbled for his license and gave it to the man, never taking his eyes off him. But when John reached for his insurance card, his hand came up empty. The answer to the last question, it turned out, was everything. And it turns out John knew a lot more than he was letting on. He stammered and said he couldn't find his insurance card, then offered to take the man to see it. As they walked together, the supposed neighbor informed John that he was actually a police officer and that he was under arrest. The officer then patted John down, searched him briefly, and then escorted him back to the unmarked car. The whole time, John had no idea why he was being arrested. But that soon changed. But it turns out that all of these men were African American, and the lead investigator was a white man named James F. Davis. Davis saw Margaret's death as a racial incident and believed that 4 black men had kidnapped and killed her during what he called a ritualistic sex attack. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, Davis presented this theory to his superiors, but they wanted to keep a lid on the story. Afraid of what a high-profile racial murder trial could do to the community, the case quickly went cold. This had to be some kind of mistake, right? Wrong. The police had come to arrest John for a murder that had gone unsolved for over 45 years. Actually, this neighbor wasn't even a neighbor. A normal person might have just apologized, maybe exchanged insurance information, and gone about their day. But this neighbor wasn't normal. She told her mother she was going shopping at Stanford Shopping Center in nearby Stanford. But instead of buying the skirt and blouse she'd requested, Margaret headed to the university campus. After spending time with friends, she set off toward home around 6:30 p.m. Her usual route took her through the Stanford Dish, a circular area where several hiking trails converged near the base of a hill. It was here where she was attacked, sexually assaulted, and strangled with her own pantyhose. Her body was left by the side of the trail and discovered by a hiker 2 days later. The man John just hit with his car was an undercover police officer who had been waiting in a nondescript sedan for the perfect moment to confront John with a secret he thought he'd buried decades ago. What happened next shocked John, and when the truth of the matter came out, it turned out this guy wasn't the only one. In this video, we dive deep into this unbelievable story on March 18, 1963. 15-year-old high school sophomore Margaret Williams boarded a bus in Palo Alto, California. The ensuing investigation would uncover nothing. That is until 2018, when cold case investigators reopened the file. But what was he doing in Palo Alto? As soon as the undercover officer in John's neighbor's disguise approached him, he knew something was up. A normal person might have responded with a nervous laugh, but John was scared. Upon arriving at the station, John learned that he was in trouble for the 1963 murder of Margaret Williams. As the police questioned him, it became clear that John's denial of guilt was genuine. In 1963, John had been living in Heidelberg, West Germany, where his father was stationed at the U.S. Army's Heidelberg military prison. It turned out that John had already been arrested and convicted for Margaret's murder. But how did his neighbors find out? What did the police say? And how was John ultimately brought to justice? After his release from juvenile prison, he'd kept a low profile, changing his name and moving to California, but he never stopped thinking about Margaret. But it was too late. The police had already found his old address and were watching his house. He was charged with 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of kidnapping. In September 2021, a jury found John guilty of first-degree murder with great bodily injury. Be sure to check out the playlist for more true crime stories from the Golden State. Thanks for watching.